Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm glad we got the mic situation sorted out. So, as was mentioned, I'm here to tell you all how you can get started in making open source contributions. So I'll just add a little bit to the bio. I was recently welcomed as a new core developer for NumPy doc, and that actually weaves very well into the story and what I'm going to share with you today. So I want to lead with that, and then we'll talk about how that happened. So we're going to start by talking about some open source contribution myths. Then I'm going to teach you all how you can find a project to work on. And then once you have that project, how you can identify a way to contribute to that project. Then we'll discuss how you can actually make your contribution and do it successfully. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So let's dispel some open source myths. So the first one is that only professional developers and maintainers can contribute to open source projects. Now, open source projects are built by people in the community for all of us in the community, right? So you're going to be hard-pressed to find a project that does not want help of some form, right? A lot of times people are volunteering to make these, so any help they can get is going to be much appreciated. And you're going to be able to find contributions for people of all levels, right? There are many different ways of helping out a project that don't necessarily have to be implementing a brand new feature, all right? Or even a code contribution. So that second myth is then that only experts can contribute something meaningful. So as I was saying before, there's a variety of ways to contribute. So as a non-expert, your experience with the project is obviously going to be different from someone who's a seasoned maintainer. And that's actually an asset, right? So consider someone new coming to that project. They're going to be tripping up on some of the same things that you got tripped up on when you started, right? And if you're closer to being new than you are to being that expert maintainer, you're actually much better positioned to put yourself in the shoes of what does a newcomer need to know, right? So you have a tremendous ability to contribute to the project in that capacity. And so it's important to think about ways that aren't necessarily code contributions, right? Making tutorials, improving documentation, putting in bug reports. Those are all ways that you can help that project out. So first up, we'll talk about now how we can find a project to work on. And I actually think this is the hardest part of making a contribution, right? Once you have a task to work on, it becomes like you're at work, right? You know, okay, I need to implement this or I need to document that. And it becomes relatively straightforward in comparison, right? Compared to, I don't know, how many open source projects exist? I don't know the number, right? And then within those, how many tasks could you maybe handle? Even if they're not even in the backlog, it might be something that you could do. That's infinite, right? There's no way you could possibly know all that. So this is probably where you're going to spend the most time, is finding something, a project that you can work on, and then something within that project. So that's where we're going to focus on in this talk. And again, focusing on not just limiting, oh, it has to be a code contribution, but what other ways I can help this project, period. So first thing I like to do is to sit down and brainstorm potential projects, right? So I put these lists of 5. You can maybe start jotting things down as I'm talking about it. I don't want you to overthink this, right? So what were like 5 open source projects that you've used recently that come to mind? I don't care what your experience level is, but you've used it in some way. Write it down. We'll go through this list later, right? So in the interest of time, I will go on, but I invite you to do this exercise later as well, if you don't have anything that comes to mind right now. So when you have that list, now we can actually start evaluating whether each of those is reasonable or suitable. And I have 5 criteria here that I like to use. So the first thing is to look at the software license. So what license is that software distributed on? And this is going to depend on your situation. So for example, in my situation, I have restrictions on what I contribute to based on the fact that I work for somebody, right? And my employer, there's restrictions on that. You don't want to be the person responsible for having all the proprietary code released to the public, right? So very quick check, and it's a very easy way to eliminate some option if it has a license that's not going to be compatible. The next thing is to check for recent activity. So you might look at, maybe it's a package on PyPI. When was the last release? Was it 5 years ago? Okay, so maybe there's nothing going on there. Maybe that package is obsolete. Maybe it's been abandoned, right? That's not going to be the best use of your time compared to something that, oh, it had a release 2 days ago. Okay, so that's alive. There's a heartbeat, right? And you might also want to look at, even if you can find the repository, if there's activity in there, right? Trying to even make a contribution, putting a PR in and having it sit there for years is not really going to be motivating at all either. The next thing I like to look at is the code base size, right? Not to say that a big code base is going to be a blocker from you contributing. It's just something you have to be cognizant of. So there's two sides to this. Something with a big code base might be lacking in the documentation because it's a lot more to cover. So you might have an easier time contributing examples to the documentation for something like that. But implementing a brand new feature might be harder because it might be close to feature complete, or there just be so many other moving pieces that you have to be aware of. So this is more of just something kind of to size your efforts and kind of figure out where you can go. It's not really something that would remove it from your list. It's more to help you prioritize. The next thing to consider is the tech stack. And by this, I don't necessarily mean it's Python, right? So if it's Python, you probably can contribute to it. But it also matters what it is in Python. So if it's maybe a library that you have never contributed to, so maybe like something like Seaborn for visualization, and if you've never contributed to that, but you know matplotlib really well, which is underneath all of it, then you can still contribute to Seaborn fairly easily without having to know exactly how Seaborn works under the hood. So doing some research to figure out how that project is built, what's underneath it, is going to help you decide whether that's worth investigating further. And the final thing is to check for the repository access, right? So in the example where we find something on PyPI, there's probably going to be a link somewhere to the repo, but maybe there's not. So now you can't find the code. So, well, that's off the table. There's no point in looking into that further, right? If there is, great. Now you can go there and see if maybe you can get access to it. Is it public? So things like that. And keep in mind, it's not a requirement that it's on GitHub. It could be GitLab or some other thing. So you might have to create an account elsewhere if you want to contribute to that. Okay, so hopefully after this point, you have at least one project that is suitable. Typically you will have multiple ones, and so that's where that ranking kind of comes into play. So you're going to use what you know about the code base size and the tech stack to figure out where best to put your efforts, right? And the maturity of the code base is also something you want to consider. So if that code base was big because it was very mature versus something has a big code base and is like constantly new things coming in, then that's going to be a little easier too, right? So by now you should have that prioritized list of where you want to focus your efforts. And now we're going to talk, the meat of this talk is how you actually find something within that project to contribute. So I'm going to talk about 5 different strategies that I've used with different open source projects for each of them. So it's kind of like, this is one way to get your foot in the door in that project, and you kind of see if you like it there or you want to keep moving around. No judgment on either end of that. So the first suggestion I have here, first strategy, is to participate in sprints. So I participated in my first sprint, and you can see in this tweet, at EuroPython in July of 2022. And we're going to see if my pointer shows up. It does. That's me. And these two are scikit-learn maintainers who are actually at this conference. I don't know if they're in this room, but they're at this conference. So this was an absolutely incredible experience. I learned a ton, and it kind of set the tone for my overall growth in the open source world, and eventually actually did lead to becoming a core developer at NumPyDoc. So in this sprint, and I will also say that scikit-learn does a fantastic job at organizing the sprints, so if you ever have an opportunity to sprint with him, that would be my pick. So definitely recommend that. So they had selected some what they call meta issues for us to work on, and the main one that we were working on as beginners to the project was to get all their doc strings conforming to the NumPyDoc standard. So basically they have a template of what needs to be done, like we want to do these changes, here are the places that need the changes still, and then everyone of us in this group would take one of those, make a change, put it in a PR, and get the feedback. Now I had gotten one in, and I was working on my second, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. NumPyDoc was telling me the doc string didn't end in a period. And I'm looking at it, the maintainer's looking at it, we see it ends in a period. We were very confused. Eventually, I just decided, okay, I'm going to just delete the doc string and do it again. There was actually a trailing space at the end, and it wasn't showing up. So I asked the maintainers after I fixed it, I'm like, so how do you not have this happen on your side? and I learned about pre-commit from them, right? And that also led me to, after I looked it up later, to actually contribute to several other repos that I'm not going to talk about here, but several other repos that wanted to set up pre-commit but didn't know how to do it. So I was given that push, right? And that's also like an important thing to highlight about the sprints. It's like this is a very unique opportunity to sit with the maintainers and ask them how they do it. Like, how do they manage the code base? How do they look through it? What editors do they use? Tools like pre-commit, right? This is something that you maybe wouldn't experience if you're only asking your teammates at work, right? You're going to get a very different viewpoint versus when you're asking people who work on very different things. So again, cannot recommend that enough. So I have some tips here for getting the most out of a sprint experience, and hopefully you will all get to experience one. So the first thing, and this might sound pretty obvious, is to pick a project that interests you. But it's possible that none of them are really, really interesting, and so pick the one that most interests you. Typically what happens is there'll be a listing of the projects that are participating in the sprint, and the maintainers will either talk about what they're hoping to work on, or there'll just be a listing on a website and you can pick. So do your research. It's almost like you're on a mini job, right? A short-term internship or something. You want to do something interesting because that's going to motivate you to actually continue and potentially even do so after the sprint ends. And then to also look for beginner-friendly projects. And by beginner-friendly, I don't mean that you've never coded before or you're brand new to Python. That might be true, but beginner-friendly in the sense that you don't know all the internals of the library, right? So if you try to contribute to something that's very mature and they have these things that all the issues are maybe end up turning into rewriting the entire parser, that's going to be very hard to just come sit down after not having worked on this and then all of a sudden do that in a day, right? So look for the projects that are able to help people who are new to that project, new to developing in that project, to get something done within the time frame of a sprint, because maybe you're only there for a day or two, right? So you want to use that time to actually get something done. And then definitely use the fact that the maintainers are there. So ask them for support. They usually come with an agenda of what they want to achieve, right? So the issues that they want to tackle. That's helpful both for actually getting things done and for the beginners and whoever wants to come to know exactly what they're going to work on and get the help, right? So if they want to get that stuff done, you want to contribute, right? Asking them just makes a whole lot of sense, right? You move along faster with what you're trying to do. And as I mentioned before, it's a tremendous opportunity to learn from them, right? To meet with the maintainers, understand how they do things, ask how they navigate the code base. So use this opportunity as an opportunity to learn. Go in ready to pick their brains and maybe share some of your knowledge. It might be that you use a tool that they've never heard of, or you know some command shortcut in your editor, right? So just let it be like a very friendly experience between you and the maintainers. Okay, so the second strategy I have is contributing examples to the documentation. So I'm sure everyone in this room has looked at the project's documentation before and has had trouble figuring out how to use it, right? It's just how it happens, right? So were there maybe examples? Potentially. If there were examples, did they work? Were they confusing? Could they have been improved? Was it trivial data that you were like, I don't understand why I would want to use this? Those are all things that could be improved, right? When someone's trying to build a project and then all this documentation, it's a lot of work, right? So it's definitely possible that there are ways to improve it as an outsider coming in. So here's an example, and hopefully you can see. So for a personal project, I wanted to use NumPy's polynomial degree function, and there were no examples on the time. So it was just from this point up. And I was reading degree, and I couldn't figure out what order it wanted the degrees in. So maybe this is something that seems very obvious to the maintainers, but there's room for misinterpretation of that. Is it lowest to highest, highest to lowest? I don't know. So what did I have to do? I had to open up Python shell. I had to run some examples to figure out, what is the order these should be in? And also I had a question, what happens if there's a 0? Does it get chopped off? Does it keep the term? So after I did this, I was like, well, these should be in the docs so that someone else doesn't have to do this exact same exercise that I just did. So I added these to the docs to clarify that. And you also find that when you just do something like that, that the maintainers are usually very appreciative because they didn't even have to ask for anything or do anything, and it's just like, whoa, our documentation is getting better, right? So every project does need good documentation, but unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to make that documentation. So what may often happen is that the maintainers will have to prioritize the roadmap and moving forward the project, and maybe can't spend a month revamping the docs and writing examples for everything, right? But this is also where it makes it very easy for someone to come in and contribute to, right? Because maybe you want to learn, how does this particular thing work, right? You can take a piece of the library that you've never explored before and just check, is there examples here? No, okay, I'm gonna learn how this works. Now you know how that works, and you get a contribution where you can contribute those examples to the documentation. And again, as someone coming from the outside, you are gonna know what is the misinterpretation. Maybe you read the doc and you're like, oh, it's clearly this. And then you put your example in, oh, it's definitely not that. So now you know, right? Or like, why does this not work? So that's a perfect thing to go in the example because it's an exact thing that someone else will misinterpret as well. Right? And then others will be able to learn from that. And it's a very different experience from someone who's the expert. Like clearly, that didn't seem like it needed an example because it was, I guess, very clear that it goes in that order. But someone who's not coming maybe, in that case, from a math background or not coming from having worked on the library for years is not necessarily going to have the capability to put themselves, and it's very hard, to put themselves in the shoes of what is someone brand new to this? How are they going to interpret what needs to happen here, right? Okay, so now we have our third strategy, which is to browse open issues for ideas. So here I have a screenshot from GitHub, and this was in 2023, so there maybe are more issues. And this is the scikit-learn GitHub. So you can see up at the top here, there were 1,600 open issues. So when I say browse open issues, I definitely don't expect you to read 1,600 issues. I'm sure we would probably stop after 10 max, right? So I want to talk to you about strategies to filter this down to a reasonable amount, right? So we have over here labels. So you see here, there's 100 labels. 100 is much less than 1,600, so we're getting better, right? So we click this. Now, labels are going to be defined by the repo, so you're going to have to read through just to figure out which of those 100 makes sense for you to look for. Some things that may or may not still exist from the default may be something like good first issue, which comes in, I think, in the standard in the repo, but the repo might decide that they prefer to use the word beginner or easy, right? So you have to scan through quickly and figure out what makes sense to search for. But scanning through that is a little easier because they're sorted, right? So you can figure out what words make sense. And in the screenshot, you see that once I filter for good first issue, that 1,600 now becomes 3 open issues, right? So huge reduction. And then this is very manageable to look at. And the last thing I want to point out on this slide is you see over here, these are the comments that have been on each of these issues. Typically what I like to do is look for things that have few comments. And the reason for that is, it's an extra click to open the issue, scroll to the bottom and see, oh, someone's already claimed this or someone's already working on this, right? So you want to optimize your time. And so the way I do that is by looking at that number. Now in this case, it's a little misleading, right? Because you see here, meta issue. So this is something in scikit-learn world where you want to see this. Disregard the number of comments. If you see this, this is good for you, right? Because this means that this is essentially a template of what you can follow and get a PR. And there's probably maybe 100 different tasks they want to do in that one thing. And based on the number of comments, that means other people have already did it and probably gotten it merged. So you can look at theirs and figure out, oh, how do they want me to do this change exactly, right? Okay. So some tips for this. So again, mentioned before, looking for tags like beginner, easy, good first issue, but look through the labels, figure out what makes sense for that repo. It might not be the same. And I also want to emphasize that you should not disregard old issues. So just like when you use Google and you never really leave the first page, maybe you go to the second page, right? So think about this. How many people filter through the issues and then go past 5, 6, 7 pages? So a story from my side was I was actually procrastinating from studying, and I looked through the issues of Seaborn. And I found, I think it was the second to last issue, and they wanted to add reference lines to some grid plots. And I was like, oh, that's easy. That's like a loop with like one line of matplotlib. I can do that, right? But it was old, so I asked. I was like, do you still want to do this? Yes, but because it was old, it was buried. No one was commenting on it. No one was looking at it. So definitely make sure you look at that stuff. I said before about searching for the meta issues. Those are essentially going to be a template of what you need to do with examples. Scikit-learn does a fantastic job at that, making those very detailed. And then the last thing, we were talking about the comments. So when you decide to work on something, make sure you say you're working on it. It'd be really a shame to not say something and have someone beat you to the PR and then get that merged after you were still working on it, right? So just be upfront, communicate that you're working on it. And you can also ask in there, like, I want to work on this, but I need a little help. They'll also help you. So just share your progress. Okay, so next up we have identifying and fixing a bug. So this is now going to require a much more heavy use of the project. You need to be using the software a lot to see something that's unexpected and hasn't been seen before, right? But there's also the possibility that you're new to the project and you're reading the getting started documentation and the code they give you doesn't work, or there's a typo, right? So those are both sides of this. So when you do find something like that, you're going to put in a bug report. So here I have an example from the pandas documentation. And they use a template for the bug report, so it's easy. You just fill in the form. Sometimes the repo does not have this, but this is a very good guideline of what you should put in there. So first thing, and these are a little bit small, but they have these checkboxes up here. So the first one says that you've checked the issue has not already been reported. So you go through the issues. You're going to have to type some words that match what you're experiencing, and search through the closed and opened issues, both. You want to make sure that it hasn't already been reported and determined it was user error, right? Or that it hasn't already been fixed. And that leads to these two down here, which is to confirm that it's in the latest version of the library and that it's also present in the main branch, as in it hasn't already just been fixed and you didn't have that change. And again, you don't want to be wasting the maintainer's time either if they have to keep closing 5, 6, 7 of the same bug report because people aren't going through that, right? It's an effort to help them save the time. And so in my case, one of the things I noticed was I was making a horizontal bar plot with pandas, and I was adding the x-axis and y-axis labels all through the plot call. And I noticed that when I did that, the x-axis label would end up on the y-axis, and the y-axis label would just disappear. So clearly something was wrong. But plotting is not really like the main core functionality of pandas. And so that was something that may not have been handled right away in that release, right? If a bug like that, and I had seen that actually for a good year before I was like, okay, I need to fix this. This is getting ridiculous, right? So that's also a unique opportunity to change the priority of something, right? If you're working on something and you're running into that bug, you probably want it fixed more than they do. Maybe they're like, oh yeah, we know it's there. It's a known issue. We'll get to it. It's not top priority. But you have the power to change the priority on that. All right. So we discussed making sure that it's not already been fixed or reported. Do the maintainers the same kindness that you would appreciate if this was your project. Being very, very detailed with your bug report and making sure that you provide them with a reproducible piece of code, right? So that they can confirm, yes, this is a bug, or no, actually, we changed how that works, and this is expected behavior, right? You want to be able to get to that conclusion quickly. And when you can also say in your bug report that you would like to volunteer to fix it, right? And then that will also help the maintainers like, yeah, this is a bug. Sure, you want to go ahead and fix it right away, and you can go ahead and do that. And you can also ask for help if you're not sure how to do that, and they can give you a pointer. Oh, probably look in here. And yes, just make sure you're always asking them for guidance. Okay, so the final strategy I have here is to propose and implement a new feature. And again, with heavy use, you'll know what are the pain points, what is really annoying to do, and maybe have some ideas on how to fix it. And so on my end, when I learned about pre-commit and NumPyDoc, I wondered why there wasn't a pre-commit hook for NumPyDoc. So I went ahead and built that. And then I approached the NumPyDoc maintainers if they were interested in having that. And they were, so then I went through the process of incorporating it. And so you'll see this looks similar to the bug report where you put in an issue, you describe what you want to do. In this case, they knew what pre-commit hooks were, and so it didn't really need to have like a huge explanation. But if you want to explain some feature or maybe some new plot type you want to add, then you might have to have some more examples in there. Okay, so again, you need to make sure that the feature hasn't already been requested. So what if someone had already asked them, do you want to make a pre-commit hook? And they're like, no, we don't really want to do that. That's going to mess up or whatever. So if I had put it in again, they would be like, oh, no, we already said that we didn't want this, right? And that's something that it's definitely a possibility that it happens, right? But just make sure you give them enough detail so that they can determine, is this a direction we want to go or not? And again, we can volunteer to fix it. But just note that if you don't volunteer, it might be something like, yeah, this is a great idea, but we can't prioritize this right now, and it might sit for a while. So volunteering is going to be your best chance at getting that in. And if they don't decide to accept it, just remember not to take anything like that personally. Okay. So those were the 5 strategies, and they were in order of the level of experience you would need to have with that project, from least to most. But I want to emphasize that there is no best strategy. So you can tailor your contribution to your comfort level. As you can see, no contribution is too small. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about tips for success making that contribution. So again, make sure, very, very important, you claim the issue. You state your intentions of working on that. If there are setup instructions provided by the project, follow them. This will save you headaches, but it also might be that there's something missing in there, and now you got your first contribution ahead of what you had planned. If you're new to development, consider starting with documentation-based contributions. This will allow you to not have to necessarily focus so much on the setup and maybe installing compilers or whatever. You can just focus on, how do I make a small change? How do I get that from my computer into GitHub? And if you can attend a sprint, highly, highly recommend that you do that. And maybe they have something like a local meetup that does something similar. And be polite and patient in all of your interactions. It's public. Okay, enough said. All right, so then once you have your first contribution to the develop, some tips for you to keep up your momentum. So as I mentioned before, when I learned about pre-commit, then I saw many other repos wanted to implement that. So there's so many opportunities for cross-pollination of ideas. Once you learn something, see if somewhere else they want to do that. You might now be the expert in that. If you see others contributing to something you're also working on, the case like the meta issues, you might be able to review some of their PRs after you've gotten yours merged. This is going to get you noticed by maintainers. And the final thing is to know that your dedication does not go unnoticed, right? If you are consistently contributing, you might end up meeting people at conferences that are the maintainers that you've been talking to and your PRs. People will start to know your name, and this has happened to me with a few different projects as well. And it's kind of surprising when it does, because it's just a handle, it's not really your face, it's like a small little thing. But sticking with this could eventually lead to an invitation to become a maintainer, and that's what happened with me with NumPyDoc like a month ago, after contributing the hook. So stick with it. So thank you. I hope I inspired you to start your open source journey. If you do end up making a contribution, I'd love to hear about it, so you can tag me on social. Here's how you can follow future work, and also the slides are on my website. Maybe we have time for like one question, but if not, you can definitely catch me afterwards or outside, and I'm happy to answer anything. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So we don't have a lot of time, but we have 2 questions. So quick answer. Do you reckon those meta issues are common?
I think it depends on the repo. They are pretty common with scikit-learn. You can just check back, because scikit-learn is very active in sprints, and they very much care about being prepared for the sprints. So they will come with a meta issue ready to go, usually.
And do you have any recommendation for getting approval from company management to make open source contribution on company time?
On company time, I don't know about that. But I mean, if you really wanted to do it, I think doing it on personal time shouldn't be a problem, right?
Okay, so thank you very much again, Stefanie. I suggest you to also, there is also open space for a lightning talk still available, and see you in 10 minutes for the next talk. Thank you very much again.